Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is July 15th, 2024, and I'm delighted to be here with Ahmed Moor, a Palestinian-American writer who was born and raised in Gaza. He is co-editor of the book After Zionism, One State for Israel and Palestine. Ahmed and I recorded a podcast in March of this year, and I wanted to speak with him again in light of a piece he published in The Guardian last week entitled "The Palestine-Israel Nightmare Won't End Until We Accept These Basic Truths." I hope you listen to the first part of the conversation and read this great essay. We'll have links in it to the show notes, and I'm glad to be here with Ahmed again to continue our conversation. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Peter. Very glad to be here with you.
So let me just start broadly. What are the basic truths that people need to understand for this nightmare to end?
I think the first one, which I alluded to in the essay, but we need to remember the Palestinians and Israelis aren't unique. There's no special circumstance that can't be overcome once you adopt that frame of reference. There are very, very unique contextual realities related to the conflict. The United States putting its hand on one side of the scale, for instance. But if we stop exoticizing the Palestinians and Israelis, you begin to see how maybe we can resolve this conflict. So with that frame, you begin to look at comparable conflicts, and you see that we need a united leadership on both sides, which is capable of negotiating. Otherwise, anybody can play a spoiler, and there are always going to be groups that are interested in playing spoilers, and the way that you if they're fundamentally involved in the conflict, the way that you combat that circumstances, you bring them into the process. So that's the first thing, or one of the things I talk about in the essay. And then secondarily, there's this perspective that Hamas is uniquely evil, uniquely constituted as a terrorist entity, and that's just not true. Hamas is, in the Palestinian context, the way the Palestinians regard Hamas, it's a native Islamist political movement, which has resorted to terrorism as a way of helping achieve its policy goals. And its policy goals are very clearly described in its 2017 charter and by analysts and others. Hamas seeks Palestinian independence. Admittedly, there are many of us who don't subscribe to the view of Palestinian statehood that Hamas does. For instance, an Islamic society, an Islamic state. Palestinian society is very mixed, but that in a pluralistic society, you have a range of views presented, and Hamas is one of those. And I think it corresponds to the right wing in other places here in the United States and Israel, etc. And then finally, and this came up through a conversation with you about South Africa. Again, if we regard Palestine-Israel as nothing very special at all, in order for us to resolve this nightmare, we need some kind of leveling around not just the conversation, who has a right to self-defense, who doesn't have a right to self-defense, who's a hostage, who's not a hostage. Jewish Israeli privilege is taken taken for granted as a starting point for lots of people. And if we think about it a little bit differently, if we frame it in a domestic context and talk about white privilege or whatever it may be, you begin to see how that's problematic. And in America, we believe in kind of pluralistic liberal democracy, I hope. And
Some of us.
Some of us. And that has implications for which arguments are regarded as legitimate, and which arguments are regarded as maybe existing on the fringe and not very serious for where they start and where they ultimately end up. So those are the points I make in the piece.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think your point is really, really important, which is that if you de-exceptionalize Israel Palestine and say, you don't need a PhD in this, nor do you need to have a particular ethnic or religious attachment to either side. You just need to apply your basic principles that you have in general, right? Then all of a sudden, a lot of things that we kind of take for granted in the Israel-Palestine conversation, I mean, we, like the American political journalistic mainstream, start to be make no sense at all, right? Because we wouldn't, I mean, even really basic things like the fact that Israel, inside Israel, not even talking about the West Bank, Gaza, has a segregated educational system, right? These are Palestinian citizens go to separate schools, right? I mean, so, but I think one of the points that when one steps back and looks at other places of profound inequality, domination, structural oppression, is how does the group that's being oppressed want to achieve its rights? What is the vision? And I'm interested in asking you to talk about where you think we are in the history of the Palestinian national movement on that point. You were alluding to the fact that, you have written about one equal state. There was an earlier vision in which Palestinians were talking about a secular democratic Palestine. But then you said that you thought Hamas actually would prefer a separate Palestinian state. So where do you think that the debate among Palestinians is? Because in a way, of course, Israeli Jews are not really interested in offering any of these things, right? But in some sense, until the demand is clear, it's hard to even know how one would expect them to respond.
Yeah. So I think starting from an ideal state is perhaps less helpful when you talk about political configurations. But starting from an ideal state when it comes to the assertion of individual rights is helpful and appropriate. And so, again, we have this liberal democratic context that you and I live in. I'm in Philadelphia, you're in New York. And when people talk about the state of this democracy, that's really what's at stake, and that's what's worth fighting for. And so what does that assertion of individual rights in Palestine and Israel look like? And then so there are any number of political outcomes, geographical political outcomes that could correspond to that individual rights argument, that could develop based on the existing configuration of things. And then, of course, the reality of trying to reconcile people after a genocide. This reality may be insurmountable in that sense. So if I start from equal rights, from the idea that any one of the 12 million or whatever it is, people who live in that country, Palestine, Israel, should have the right to freely associate, should have the right to travel, to study, should be obligated to pay taxes and to vote for their local administrator. You get to either a one state with full equal rights, or what Dalia Scheinman described as a confederation. Because I don't in an ideal, I'm a liberal. In an ideal world, everybody would be free to intermingle, and people who are socially conservative or members of right-wing movements, whether they be Palestinian or Jewish Israeli, can associate freely with one another. And those who aren't, people who are more liberally inclined, should be free to associate and make their own arguments in this competition of ideas in a democratic system. But I don't see that happening in the context of the genocide. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, let's be really, really insistent on individual rights. And then what are the possible political configurations? And how do we devolve power probably to these statelets that'll have to coordinate with one another? I don't think anybody really knows what the right answer is, but to my mind, if we're operating from a point of departure, which is today, this awful genocide, that seems to be the most workable outcome. What Hanan al-Sharawi and Dalia Scheinman both described as people's self-determination.
So you're talking about then two separate political entities, but highly integrated with one another.
I think the question of geographical integrity is important, but equally the question of mutual security. We've heard my whole life, we've heard about the insecurity of Jewish Israelis, but there's a corollary, there's a parallel argument, which is Palestinian insecurity.
Right.
The Palestinians have no reason to believe that to entrust their security to a primarily Jewish Israeli force of any kind, and that goes to police, that goes to the military. And so then what's the possible outcome here? So settlements have done away with total partition, which I think was a bad idea anyway. We need some kind of structure which preserves the rights of individuals. And then from a communitarian point of view, people say they care about self-determination, whatever that means, yet to be defined, and security, which is a concrete and unavoidable task. How do you provide security to the community that you're a member of?
Yeah. I wanted to go back to what you're saying about Hamas, because you said something that I think that many people who get their news from just kind of mainstream American media would be really surprised to hear, right? Which is that you said that you think that Hamas basically wants a Palestinian state. I think the view one would get from mainstream American media is that what Hamas wants is to create an Islamic state between the river and the sea, and force all the Jews to leave, if not kill them all. So as someone who is yourself from Gaza, right, and I imagine over the course of your life has known members of Hamas and has seen that movement, tell me why how you come to your analysis of what you think Hamas's goals is, and how you reconcile with that, with the fact that, as I understand it, Hamas is pretty explicit in that it does not accept the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I'll start with the legitimacy. Lots of Palestinians don't accept the legitimacy of Israel. And I've got to be careful how I say this, but I also don't accept the legitimacy of an apartheid state, which is moving large amounts of its population. I mean, fundamentally, this country is violating international law at every opportunity. That's my view.
Right.
Where one goes from there is kind of the important next step.
Yeah.
I think countries that seek legitimacy should seek to work within the limits or the strictures of international law, should observe human rights, and should negotiate legitimacy with their adversaries. And this is true of lots of different countries in the world, but we're talking about Israel Palestine today. And so even that question of legitimacy as such, that's a prize to be won through negotiations that are conducted in good faith, that seek to resolve all outstanding issues. Now, the question of Hamas, there's a great video of Josh Hawley, who's articulate and seems thoughtful in lots of ways, but also is
also incredibly dangerous. Yeah,
exactly. And so he's at the dais somewhere, and he's talking about how some liberals have described his vision of the United States as a Christian.
Yes.
And he openly admits that his vision is a Christian country. We're not going to lock up Josh Hawley. We're not going to put Josh Hawley in an underground bunker and say, you're some terrorist.
I just hope he doesn't lock us up. Right.
Well, exactly. This is where you and I have mutual interest. But in a democracy, I'm not going to say a healthy democracy, but in a pluralistic society, you've got lots of people who express views that you don't agree with, that you may regard as odious. And certainly the idea that America is a Christian nation is antithetical to everything that I believe. The idea that Palestine should be an Islamic country goes against the long Christian history in that country, goes against the pre-state Jewish history in that country, pre-Israel Jewish history in that country. Hamas would like to see an Islamic state in Palestine. And as you may have read in the piece, the 2017 charter basically concedes that Palestine is going to be Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, kind of in line with the Oslo consensus. Again, that boat has sailed, but Hamas is on board with that, if one takes what they've said at face value, or what they've written at face value, rather. It's not a view that I subscribe to, the idea of an Islamic government. I think many Palestinians, even the most recent polls indicate Hamas only commands a plurality of support. And when you dig deeper into the polls and you look at who Palestinians would like to see as president, it's not the Hamas candidate, potentially Ismail Haniyeh. It's it's Marwan Barghouti, or somebody who's a secular Palestinian, more associated with Fatah. So Palestinian society is not monolithic. My only argument is that, or my argument about Hamas is that this is not an exceptional movement by any means. Nor are the right-wing Jewish Israeli movements exceptional. If one takes a bigger historical view, it's kind of an ordinary conflict. If we just get out of the way and kind of insist, we as the United States, and insist that the parties come to the table and make reasonable concessions on either side, we'd have had two states long ago. Or if there hadn't been a genocide, maybe one state in the future.
Yeah. I want to pick up on that point because I think you're saying something really, really important and really difficult. I was speaking in Arizona a few in the spring, and I talked and I offered a vision which I don't think would be very different than the vision that you support of one equal state, equality under the law, and an effort at historical justice for the wrongs that have been done in the past. And a Palestinian woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I have been arguing that for a long time. She said, after what's happened in Gaza now, I don't know that those people will ever be able to live alongside Israeli Jews. I wonder, how is this vision of equality and people living in one political unit, whatever the particular parameters of how it's organized are, but with the principles of equality and historical justice, is it still possible now, or does it require us to think in some different way in response?
It's such a hard question to answer. I mean, what I've learned over time is you make do with what you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I lived in Lebanon in 2009, 2010, and the scars of that civil war are still very apparent. You get in a service. I lived in both East and West Beirut, and I used to volunteer in a Palestinian camp, Shatila. And there were drivers from some of the Christian neighborhoods who wouldn't take you beyond a point in the city. And meanwhile, there were people from Ras Beirut, kind of the Sunni Palestinian parts of the city, who had never crossed into other parts of the city. And we're talking about a really, something which feels as dense as the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Yes. I think that's the case still in Belfast.
Right.
There's still that very strong segregation of neighborhoods. Yeah.
Exactly. And yes. So those, one doesn't declare peace and find a political solution and suddenly, panacea, everything's okay. That's not how it works. I think irrespective of what outcome we describe as the ultimate resolution, which may be affected, well, there's still going to need to be, one or two generations that live and die and hopefully forget the horror. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. The Jewish Israelis aren't going anywhere. The first step has to be a halt to the harm. And then I think people will find an accommodation with the reality. And it's not going to be a very nice accommodation. If we're able to hew to and commit to a set of core principles that help guide us out of the nightmare and prevent further harm, and then allow for institutions to develop that try to uncover the truth, uncover the extent of the harm, maybe that's a second and third step. But it's hard to say right now that, the Palestinians are going to be very comfortable shopping at grocery stores that, where the guy bagging groceries was a reservist in 2024 and did unspeakable things, and vice versa. I know Israelis imagine all Palestinians participated in the events of October 2023. Right or wrong, that's the popular imagination, and it takes time.
Right. How do you respond to folks who say, and again, I don't think this is a dominant view, but I think this view exists, and I'm curious how prevalent you think it is and whether you think it's grown, and to people who say, maybe especially after what's happened in Gaza, I support a vision of decolonization in which I would like Israeli Jews, at least, unless, this should have been an Arab country. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these were gained independence as Arab countries. This should have been and should be an Arab country, right? And if there were some Arab Jews, fine, and maybe there's some Jews who can accommodate themselves to that. But those who can't should go back to the countries in which they're from. Obviously, this is not a view that I'm comfortable with, and I don't think it's. But one hears it on the I do hear it on the fringes of some discussions, and I feel like perhaps it has gained some more traction. And you know, whether people talk about Algeria, or how do you respond to someone who says, well, that would be my preferred vision?
For me, it's a non-starter, so it's not my preferred vision. I don't think that my desire is to see an end to this conflict. The idea of, I mean, how many Jewish Israelis are there in Israel? The idea of millions of people doing what? Getting on boats or airplanes? Are there that many airplanes in the world? I don't know. To go where? It doesn't make any sense today. I think when I hear, and I hear that as well, and I see it on Twitter and stuff, I think when I hear that people are responding to the fundamental my interpretations, people are responding to the fundamental injustice of 1948, the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which has never been discussed in a meaningful setting within Israeli society. You know, you've got Benny Morris today calling for a nuclear annihilation of Iran, and he knows more about the Nakba than virtually anybody in that society.
Right. It's just that he doesn't think it was a bad thing.
Exactly. Yes. And I think people are just frustrated, or maybe not. We take people at their word. Anybody who's calling for the expulsion of Jewish Israelis from Israel is wrong on two counts, I'd say. First, it's just going to prolong that kind of language, and that kind of goal prolongs this conflict. I don't want to see this conflict prolonged. Second, that idea doesn't really conform to my view of what liberal society is, which is kind of the fundamental principles-based issue. So impractical, but that's a small thing. Wrong from a moral point of view, which is the big thing. I don't think many of us were born in the United States. I wasn't born here. The United States was much more successful than Israel in one regard. The US did a good job of eliminating, annihilating, killing all of the natives.
Right.
And so we don't have this conflict in the US today.
Right.
Israel wasn't very efficient at killing the natives.
Right.
And so we have this discussion.
Right.
But if we accept that Palestinian-Americans who were born in Chicago should stay and be free to live in Chicago forevermore, then I think the parallel statement is that somebody who, through no fault of their own, was born in Haifa or Tel Aviv or wherever, has to be able to conduct their life within the framework of equal rights.
Right. Well, let me ask the flip side of the question, because you mentioned Benny Morris, who also famously said that he wished that Israel had finished the job in 1948 and expelled all the Palestinians. So you're arguing against the Palestinian who thinks our goal should be the expulsion of Israeli Jews, but there are also a lot of Israeli Jews who think who have not given up on what we could call the American style solution, right? Which is to push settler colonialism so far that basically you either expel or just kill so many people that they're no longer a problem. And I wonder how, you know, why are we so convinced? I mean, it's almost too horrifying to think about it, but why are we so convinced that they are wrong, that they cannot, that the Naftali, you know, the Bezalel Smotriches in the world of Wenger, that they can't actually succeed in doing this, given what we've seen in Gaza, where no governments of real power have really stopped them?
Yeah, I was speaking with a friend, and he was describing how hard it is to imagine one state with equal rights at this juncture, and two states as well. I said, well, there's another potential outcome here, which is that the Jewish Israelis who are committed to Zionism will succeed in seeing that vision through. Biden, Trump will continue to support their genocide. And we will see the total annihilation of the people, the Palestinian people, as a national group. And that's very hard for me to say, and it's a hard thing to acknowledge, but that is a real possibility here, which is, and the only groups which are offering any resistance today are Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And I think that's another point that I made in the article, and I knew that it would be, it's almost taboo to say, the Palestinians have a right to self-defense.
Mhm.
The Palestinians have a right to resist their own extermination. And the fact that that's a controversial statement illustrates, I'd say, part of the power imbalance and why the genocide has been permitted to proceed in the way that it has. But the Palestinians will resist. I mean, you're beginning to see some of the tactics adopted by Hamas and Gaza, adopted by other groups who are more or less independent in Tulkarm and parts of the West Bank.
Means there's like Lion's Den and these newer groups, right?
Yeah. I don't think the Palestinians are going to go quietly into the night. They'll resist.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you have a nuclear armed state, which is aided and abetted by virtually the entire kind of Western monolith, policy apparatus. And it's possible that the Jewish Israelis will succeed in exterminating or expelling the Palestinians. I'm hopeful that that won't be the outcome, because the Palestinians are going to resist, and the expense will be high for the Israelis. But it's something that we have to consider. If we're talking about expulsion, the West Bank Palestinians can't really go anywhere except for Jordan, and you're seeing potentially a major destabilization of Jordan with which the Jordanians are aware of. And King Abdullah, very early on in the conflict, said, "We're not taking any refugees," and that was a clear signal that the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank into Jordan, that's not going to happen again, and that's the history in '67. Egypt as well, and there are lots of problems with what Egypt is doing, but I would say Egypt's insistence on holding that line and refusing to accept large amounts of refugees is,
despite pressure, as has been reported on them to do so. Yeah,
enormous pressure, is one of the firm, I'd say, one of the firm impediments to that outcome that some Jewish Israelis, probably a large amount of Jewish Israelis, seek.
right. So you mentioned armed resistance, and again, these are sensitive and difficult conversations to have in American public discussion. But I think that they're important to have. And I think, as you say, to normalize our conversation with Israel Palestine, which doesn't mean abandoning principles about morality, international law. It just means thinking about how we understood them in other contexts. The ANC, did armed resistance. They did generally try to avoid civilian targets. The IRA, I think, was less scrupulous about avoiding civilian targets. What do you say to someone who says, "Listen, Ahmed, the way I see it, armed resistance, whether by Hezbollah getting Israel out of the south of Lebanon or Hamas getting Israel to leave Gaza, although Israel maintained, security control from outside, has been more effective than nonviolent resistance, than BDS, than going to the United Nations, than going to the International Criminal Courts." How do you respond to that? And what do you think is from an ethical perspective and a legal perspective, where does armed resistance fit into the broader panoply of resistance, including nonviolent resistance?
Yeah. So Arundhati Roy, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She's one of these people you always see in writing.
Yes, yes, I know.
She has this. She made this great statement, which is, people in the jungle somewhere, indigenous people who may be resisting loggers and their armed escorts, and I'm embellishing a little bit here to illustrate.
Right.
What's the basis for arguing that they should resist nonviolently? They resist their extermination nonviolently. If there's no audience, what's the basis for arguing that they should conduct hunger strikes if they're starving already? That doesn't really make much sense. And I think with the Palestinians, you saw the Great March of Return, where the Israelis killed scores of Palestinians on the border for approaching the border, the borders of the prison, the borders of Gaza.
Yes.
And nobody paid attention. And so then you wonder, so nonviolence is not the kind of the supreme moral tactic, I would say, when you're talking about, so to be clear, armed resistance has to occur within the context of international law. Combatants are combatants. And as much as the waste of human life and the loss and is heartbreaking and awful, it really should only occur between combatants. And it's better avoided if you can avoid it. But there is a framework there where I'd say that to the extent that you're facing extermination, whether it's in the Warsaw Ghetto or the Gaza Ghetto, you have a right to resist that. And again, there's a framework for how you can do that ethically, and it doesn't include killing civilians. It doesn't include harming civilians.
Go ahead.
What Hanan Ashrawi said to me, and which resonated strongly with me, is that the Palestinians have to be thoughtful about how they employ the right to resistance. And that right needs to be tactically appropriate and appropriate to the times. Yeah. A one-on-one fight face-to-face with Israel will very quickly result in the extermination of the Palestinians. And that was also the argument against the Black Panthers in the United States. If the white majority here ever felt that Black nationalists, Black liberationists, civil rights leaders were going to participate in mass armed struggle, they would have been exterminated very quickly. There weren't very many scruples about killing Black people in this country.
Right.
So you've got to adjust your mode of resistance in a tactically appropriate way, which is also ethically appropriate and consistent with the idea that you have a right to preserve your life, and nobody has the right to take your life arbitrarily.
Right. Yeah, and there was a famous exchange between Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Buber on this question, and in which Buber rejected Gandhi's claim that the Jews in Germany and in Eastern Europe should respond only nonviolently. I guess the question, it raises the question of why do you, if I hear what you're saying is saying that there is a role for armed resistance as part of a broader resistance strategy, but it should conform to international law and I think basic morality, which suggests that you fight combatants, not civilians. And I obviously, why do you think it was? I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that had Hamas only killed Israeli soldiers and taken Israeli soldiers hostage, that the response, that Israel's response would not have been unbelievably ferocious. I'm not that naive. But I do wonder why you think it was that Hamas did not kind of conform to that norm when it breached the fence on October 7th.
Well, so to be clear, Hamas has used terror tactics in the past, and so has Israel as a state. And one of the interesting things that Brendan O'Leary said to me is that states are states primarily utilize terrorism. Like when you look at pound for pound, where does terrorism exist in the world? State terror is kind of primarily, and what that means is targeting civilians and non-combatants for political purposes. We talked previously, I think in November, about how the Haganah used terrorism to achieve political outcomes. People utilize non-ethical means of warfare to achieve their goals. I don't agree with that. I think that's morally wrong, but it's a reality. I don't know what happened in October. I don't know. I would love to gain kind of a historical understanding of what really went down in October. What were the directives? Who was in charge? Who was in control? Who were the participants? It seems to have been a chaotic scene. I think I don't have a full understanding, but Hamas has employed terror in the past. Israel has employed terrorism in the past. It's not right, but it's happened. I don't know.
Yeah. We seem to be at a point now with Israel's war in which a lot of Israelis, centrist Israelis, even center-right Israelis, are kind of admitting now that they're not going to destroy Hamas, right? That Hamas is still going to be there in Gaza, right? And some of them seem to be moving towards the position to say, well, okay, Hamas will still be there, but we destroyed killed lots and lots of their fighters, and we've destroyed a lot of their tunnels, and we've created a deterrent now because, you know, we did so much destruction that they're going to be loath to do anything like October 7th again, right? Of course, on the other hand, I mean, putting aside the moral question of killing vast numbers of people, seems to me on the other side of the ledger is that you've also basically created untold numbers of new people who want to fight against Israel because they've just seen their entire families killed. But what do you think about what this war has or has not achieved now that it may be moving towards some kind of new phase, and where it leaves the kind of balance of power between Hamas and other resistance groups on the one hand and Israel?
Yeah, and this may be my kind of ideological frame of reference, but I think Israel's lost dramatically. I grew up going to Egypt. That's how we used to go to Gaza. And my experience of being in Egypt as a kid was always one of fear. I had a sense that the Israeli state was everywhere. Hosni Mubarak and his Baltagiyya and the spies, kind of domestic spies, were everywhere and watching you. And then the Egyptian revolution, for me, which I covered and I was there for, was this casting off of a state of fear. The state didn't exist everywhere, and the state wasn't all-knowing. I think the Israelis have just gone through kind of a similar experience, at least in the perceptions of people in the region. The Israelis could credibly claim to have cowed the Palestinians in lots of ways. They asserted this kind of superior intelligence, military intelligence. The Shin Bet is feared, all-knowing. They'd conduct these raids in the West Bank and in Gaza before they left Gaza, where they would take photographs and map out an entire family, and you felt that the Israelis knew everything, were watching everything. And they've lost that. They've lost that deterrent. They've lost the claim that they're a professional fighting force, which did a lot to cow, I'd say, segments of Palestinian society. The images of 18 and 19-year-old boys prancing around in women's underwear with obscene amounts of firepower deployed haphazardly, almost as though they're playing at Chuck E. Cheese. It's absurd, and it's a laughingstock. And again, you can discount what I say because I'm definitely a partisan in this conflict. But my view of the Israelis is really as kids who are a little bit spoiled at this point, lacking discipline, lacking ability in close quarters combat, and you've had an opportunity to really pacify Palestine, really global support, wall-to-wall support, and you failed to do it. And I think that's what the Israelis have lost. They've lost that sense of deterrence. I don't know if that's retrievable. Hezbollah also has managed to, Secretary Blinken, who is not my favorite person in the world, but he said, that Israel has basically lost its sovereignty in the north.
Right.
That's a big statement.
Right.
And Hezbollah hasn't really waged war against Israel yet. Now, that war is still, it's a border conflict. It's not a real war yet. And I hope it doesn't get to that. But when you've lost sovereignty in the north, when you failed to pacify a domestic insurgency that you, in theory, had been observing for decades, that genie's hard to put back in the bottle. The Israelis have lost a lot of, I'd say, the fear is gone. The fear of Israelis is gone.
Yeah. I guess the last question I wanted to ask was, as someone who yourself is from Gaza, what do the what do Palestinians in West Bank suffer a lot as well, but what do Palestinians in Gaza who have now gone through this apocalypse, what needs to happen for them even to begin to heal from the enormity of what was been going on and is still going on?
I don't know how to answer that. That is such a big question, and it's so horrific. What's happened is so horrific. And I think about epigenetics. Like I think about how this genocide is going to be expressed in the next generation through attenuated ability or anxiety, or we're going to feel this for a long time. I don't know what the recovery looks like, but if we go back to the start of this conversation, if we de-exceptionalize the Palestinians and Israelis and say Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or even the Nazi occupation of France, horrific experiences for the people there, or the Allied occupation of Berlin and Germany, famine and privation, and how do those people recover? I think that's where you start, because if emotionally you're in it, I mean, I don't know where we go. I think
yeah, I mean, because those events at least had a clear endpoint, right? And then the beginning of something new, whether it was Jews who just left Europe and started a new life somewhere around the world, or or Japanese who came under American military occupation, but the war was over. Then you could say, okay, this is the end. And it seems like with Gaza, the most likely prospect is a just maybe slightly more attenuated version of the same.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's hard to see how in the near term Israel doesn't succeed in achieving a lot of its kind of genocidal goals. The Israelis have seized it at 26 or 27% of Gaza. Who knows if they're going to start settling there? I think there's a back and forth in that society. That's what it seems like. In the longer term, I think Israel's lost. Certainly its global standing, but I think it's going to be more and more isolated. I go back to your statement about the elites. It seems like every cultural article I read in edits is about how we've lost our access to international culinary culture, or literary culture, or film culture, and it's beginning to bite for the elites. But what that means for the Palestinians in Gaza, I don't know. What is it? How is that meaningful for the mother who's given birth to a stillborn child, or to somebody who's watched their child starve to death? It's not meaningful at all. It's bleak. I don't know where to go.
Yeah. Well, maybe one more question. I wonder if there is, again, just because in order to fight the pervasive, like just dehumanization that is so pervasive when it comes to Palestinians, and including Palestinians in Gaza, I'm wondering, when people come to you to say, like, what should I read to understand Gaza, or what should I read to understand Palestinian history and politics and culture? I'm just, if there are particular things that are meaningful to you.
That's a great question. I should be more prepared here.
Sorry, I didn't give you any warning for this.
I'd say Sarah Roy is a wonderful authority on Gaza.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And then when you want to understand kind of the Palestinian history of resistance, there's resistance in lots of different ways, and I mean, not just armed resistance, but cultural resistance, and literary resistance, and the spiritual resistance. People like Ghassan Kanafani, Men in the Sun, the perfect captures the frustration that's emerged repeatedly through our history. I can come up probably with a more complete reading list, but Rashid Khalidi is a wonderful historian as well. But
yes. No, those are great places to start. And in fact, you were mentioning of Sarah Roy, is that in addition to her writing about Gaza, she also wrote she gave a lecture many years ago, I think in Australia, that was named for Edward Said, where she actually talked about how, as the child of Holocaust survivors who never talked about their experience, she really felt like she came to understand them for the first time in a certain way when she lived in Gaza, because she saw the experience of humiliation and she was able to imagine how that had shaped them. I thought it was like a very, very powerful kind of act of like connecting these two stories. And one of the things I really, really appreciate about you, Ahmed, is the way in which And I don't quite know if I were Palestinian, if I would quite have the capacity to do this, but you're the way in which you never lose sight of the humanity of all the people in this territory, even though even as these unspeakable things are happening. And I feel like for me, that's a very, very powerful thing to witness.
I appreciate your saying that, Peter. I mean, we're in this together, and we have to get out of it together.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and you can watch video versions of our podcast, including this one on YouTube. With that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of FMAP's Occupied Thoughts.